So here we're thinking about, if I know this is the trend of the data happening, what would the projections be for time frames in the future? And we're always going to focus on these two time frames, 20 years ahead and 100 years ahead. So first thing we want to recognize, we of course have our x-axis down here, that is the year. We have the y in this example is global mean temperature. So we're seeing that average temperature of the earth in degrees Celsius. And when we look at the trend of our graph, we of course see it's going up, it's increasing. So as we make our projections to 2040 and excuse me, 2120, we are thinking about those values going up because the trend is moving the data that way. We did something like this earlier where we drew the graph and then picked some data points. That was a mere guess, a predict. This is a projection where we're calculating the rate of change to give us the exact value we would see on the data if that trend continues. So the first thing we have to do is figure out, well, what is that rate of change? How much is this global mean temperature changing per year? So I started by giving you two actual values. So we have point A, which is from 2015 with a global mean temperature of 14.75. So we plug that info in down here. Then we've got point B, which is 2020, 15 degrees. Again, plug that data in down here. So now that I have my two data points, I'm able to figure out my rate of change. I need to do a subtraction to figure out both the value and the years, right? So for starters, I'm looking at the year gap, right? What is the year change between these 2 points? So we're seeing a change in 5 years. How much of a change is determined by doing our subtraction. So that's when we can grab our calculator and plug in our values. We've got 15 minus 14.75. So we have a change of 0.25 a degree every 5 years. So that's the amount it changes for 5 years. I want to know the change for 1 year. So to get this value, I then can take my total for 5 years and divide it by 5 to know how much is happening per 1 year. So I'll take that again, divide it by 5, and that is a pretty small change every year, which for temperature is good. So I'm seeing a global mean temperature change of 0.05 degrees per year. So I can use that number then to project what will my change be in 20 years and what will my change be in 100. So if it's 0.05 every year, well, over 20 years, what will my change be? Same thing here. If it's 0.05 per year, in 100 years of that same exact change, what would my total be? So I've got 0.05 times 20, that's 1 degree of change, and 0.05 times 100, nope, 0.05 times 100, there we go, 5 degrees of change. So that's the amount of change for each of those time frames. But what I want here is what will the value be in each of those years. So thinking about my graph, my current 2020 in 2040, it will be 1 more degree, right? And then in 2125, it will be 5 more degrees. So I want to make sure I'm not putting just this as my answer, but I have to add that to my current value. So current value is 15 degrees. So for my 20-year projection, I know my current is 15. In another 20 years, it's going to go up 1 degree. My total is 16 degrees projected to be the global mean temperature average in the year 2040. Again here, I can't just plug in my 5 degrees of change. I have to add it to the current value. The temperature of the air in 2020 is 15 degrees. In 100 years, it will go up 5 more. That will be a total of 20 degrees Celsius. So once you know your rate of change, you can then figure out the change per year, multiply that out for our 2 projections. It'll always be 20 and 100. And then we have to add that to our current value to say, here we are now, right? Here we are now. In 20 years, I'm adding that much more. In 100 years, I'm adding that much more. That's what we're thinking. So let's get this one started together. And actually, let me tell you this real quick. So these are all doing the same thing. I made it so it was a graph and then the same table every single time. But as you go through each of these problems, you're losing a little bit of support from me. So the first one had the data filled in. Here I gave it to you in the graph. You have to fill it in, make your formula, and solve. This one gave you the points, but didn't tell you the values. So you're going to have to roll over here and say, okay, point A is going to be this amount. And you'll have to zoom in and come up with a number for that to plug in. Same thing for B. Here, I gave you nothing. So you not only are going to figure out your y-axis values, but you're going to choose a year time span that you want to put in and calculate with. That would make the most sense for this graph. So let's just do a little bit of number 2 together. So we've got our 2 values. A, 2000, that's the year. Year B was 2020. This one, 368 and 414. So I need to know the rate of change. How much has it gone up in that year time span? So I like to look at the years first. That's always easy. So I'm looking at these two. This is a 20-year change. And then to figure out my CO2, I've got that 414 minus 368. I'm looking at the difference between those two. 414 minus 368. So I see CO2 going up 46 parts per million every 5 years, or every 20 years. So I need to take this number and get my per year value. Well, this is my value happening in 20 years. So I need to divide that by 20 so I can get my per year value. 46 divided by 20. Cool. So 2.3 parts per million increase every year because, again, my trend is going up. So now that I know my per year value, I can project out what would that be in 20 years? What will that be in 100 years? And remember, once I get that amount, to take that 20-year change and the 100-year change, and I have to add those to the current, which for us on this graph is 2020. So when I get my projections going, it'll be the 20-year plus that current. So give it a try. Try the other two by pulling the data over, coming up with your numbers. So there'll be varied answers here. That's okay. Come up with your numbers for both of these. Submit, and as always, screenshot, send a question.